In 1893, while over 500 banks and 15,000 businesses collapsed across the country, one quiet investor spent his entire fortune buying companies nobody else wanted. He wasn't a banker. He wasn't connected to Wall Street. He simply had cash when everyone else had none. By the time he died, that fortune had multiplied many times over, and almost nobody outside his own family ever knew how it happened. His method is number 12 on this list. Number 6 was standard practice in every American factory town for decades until it was quietly made nearly impossible by regulation in the 1930s. And number 1 has been building fortunes since before the Civil War, yet modern business schools barely mention it because the people who'd profit most from you knowing it are the ones who stopped teaching it. These were not secrets. They were the basic operating logic of American wealth for over a century. Before we go further, hit subscribe because what built these fortunes had nothing to do with luck, connections, or timing the market. It had everything to do with knowing exactly what to do the moment everyone else panicked. Number 17. Buying when the banks are on fire. In 1893, the National Cordage Company collapsed, triggering a panic that wiped out over 500 banks and 15,000 businesses within the year. Unemployment in some cities reportedly climbed past 40%. Railroads that had crisscrossed the country with confident, freshly laid track were suddenly bankrupt, their bonds worth a fraction of face value, their locomotives sitting idle in rail yards because nobody had the cash to run them. Farms went unsold, mills stood dark. Most Americans saw catastrophe, and they weren't wrong to. For a working family with no savings cushion, 1893 meant real, immediate hardship. But for the handful of men who'd spent the preceding boom years quietly stockpiling cash instead of spending every dollar on expansion, catastrophe looked very different. A small group of financiers, J.P. Morgan among them, organized consortiums of bankers to stabilize what they could, while quietly buying up the wreckage of what they couldn't save. They didn't have more money than anyone else in 1892. They had the discipline to hold cash through the boom years that came before, while everyone else plowed every dollar back into expansion. When the panic passed, the people who'd kept their reserves owned the railroads, the mills, and the mines that the survivors needed to rebuild everything, often purchased for a fraction of what they'd cost to build only a few years earlier.
Decades later, Warren Buffett would distill this exact instinct into one of investing's most famous philosophies: be greedy when others are fearful. The men of 1893 never needed the slogan. They just needed the discipline. Number 16. The telegraph information edge. Before telephones reached most American businesses, the fastest way to move a price across the country was a copper wire and a trained operator tapping Morse code. Western Union's telegraph network linked grain exchanges, cotton markets, and stockyards from Chicago to New York, and the traders who paid for direct access to that wire knew a price shift minutes, sometimes hours before a farmer 3 counties away even heard the news. That gap was the entire business model. A trader standing on the floor of the Chicago Board of Trade could buy wheat at yesterday's price in Kansas and sell it at today's price in New York, pocketing the spread simply because information moved faster than people could. Entire fortunes were built on nothing more than owning the fastest line into the room where prices were set.
Today, the gap isn't measured in miles of copper wire. It's measured in milliseconds of server latency and who actually reads the filing before the headline writes itself. The principle never changed, only the wire. Number 15. Owning the whole chain, not just one link. Andrew Carnegie didn't just own steel mills. He owned the ore mines that fed them, the coke ovens that fueled them, the railroads that moved the raw material, and the ships that crossed the Great Lakes to get it there in the first place. A rival mill owner buying ore on the open market was at the mercy of whatever price the market happened to be charging that week, a price that could spike overnight if a competitor needed the same shipment. Carnegie was never at anyone's mercy because the ore was already his before it ever touched a price tag. Every dollar that would have gone to an outside supplier instead stayed inside his own company, recorded as profit rather than expense. Competitors paid market price for ore and coal. Carnegie paid his own internal cost, which was almost always lower. That gap compounded year after year until rival steelmakers simply couldn't match his prices and still survive. And one by one, they either sold to him or went under trying to compete. The principle still runs some of the largest companies in the world today. A major electric vehicle maker controls its own battery production rather than buying from outside suppliers, and the largest online retailer in the world owns its own delivery network rather than renting someone else's trucks. Control the inputs, and your competitor's margin becomes their permanent, unsolvable problem. Number 14. The ice trade nobody saw coming. In 1806, a 23-year-old Boston merchant named Frederick Tudor loaded 130 tons of frozen New England pond water onto a ship bound for Martinique and was mocked across the docks for trying to sell something that would simply melt before it arrived. He was right to be mocked at first. The venture failed, and most of the ice did melt. By 1812, he was sitting in debtor's prison, his fortune gone before it had ever really existed. But Tudor kept solving one problem at a time. By 1807, he'd discovered that packing ice in sawdust rather than hay or wood shavings dramatically slowed the melt. He built insulated ice houses at every port he shipped to, so the product had somewhere safe to sit once it arrived. He didn't just sell ice, he built the entire cold chain himself, owning the ponds where it was harvested, the ships that carried it, and the warehouses that stored it on the other end. By 1833, he was shipping ice as far as Calcutta on the other side of the world and turning a profit doing it. A journey that took roughly 4 months by sea, during which the cargo had to survive equatorial heat without simply disappearing into the hold as water. The exact logic he stumbled into, control the unglamorous, overlooked piece of infrastructure nobody respects, became the modern cold storage and warehousing industry, a sector quietly worth tens of billions of dollars today, run by companies most Americans have never heard of.
Number 13. The county auction nobody attends. Since the 1800s, American counties have sold land seized for unpaid property taxes at public auction, and the practice hasn't stopped. It's still happening in all 50 states today, often with almost nobody in the room. Picture a property worth several $1,000s with only a few $100s in unpaid back taxes attached to it. At many county auctions, the bidding doesn't start at the property's value. It starts at the amount of unpaid tax owed, which means a patient buyer with cash in hand can sometimes win it for a small fraction of what it's actually worth. Throughout the early 20th century, men who paid attention to their county clerk's auction calendar, the way other men followed the baseball schedule, quietly built land portfolios this way, parcel by parcel, year by year, simply by showing up when nobody else did. Some bought land they had no immediate use for at all, simply trusting that a growing town eventually grows toward whatever empty parcel happens to be sitting in its path. Decades later, when the town finally reached that parcel, the original purchase price looked less like a gamble and more like a foregone conclusion. The properties are still listed publicly. The schedule is still published, the auctions are still legal and still happening every single year. Most Americans have simply never been told that they exist. Number 12. Holding cash while everyone else panics. This is the investor from the cold open. During the panic of 1893, while desperate business owners begged banks for loans that no longer existed, the men who had quietly kept reserves in cash rather than reinvesting every available dollar back into expansion were the only buyers left standing when the dust settled. They weren't smarter than their competitors. They hadn't predicted the crash with any special insight. They simply hadn't spent everything they had during the good years, which meant that when the bad year arrived, they were the only people in the room who could still write a check. The skill was never picking the right investment at the right moment. It was refusing to be fully invested right before the floor disappeared, keeping just enough dry powder that when everyone else was forced to sell, you were the one person able to buy. Pattern break. Everything so far has been about what to do when the economy is actively breaking apart. What comes next is quieter. The unglamorous businesses that kept paying out for 100 years while everyone else was chasing something flashier. Number 11. The brickyard nobody wanted. Every growing American town in the 19th and early 20th centuries needed bricks for its homes, its storefronts, and its factories, and almost nobody with any ambition wanted to actually own a brickyard. It was dirty, loud, local work, hauling clay and firing kilns from sunrise to sunset, and it carried none of the social status of running a bank or a department store. That embarrassment was exactly the opportunity. A family willing to ignore the status hit and simply run the local brickyard often found themselves with little to no competition in their own town for decades because nobody else wanted the job badly enough to fight for it. The same principle still drives some of the highest margin small businesses in America today. Septic services, commercial HVAC, industrial laundry, unglamorous, slightly embarrassing, and almost entirely uncontested. Number 10. Timber rights as a multi-generational asset. Land bought purely for the trees growing on it functioned for some families as a savings account that quietly grew itself with no daily attention required. Timber doesn't need to be checked on, doesn't go bankrupt overnight, and only becomes more valuable the longer it's simply left alone to mature. A family that bought timber rights in the early 1900s and did nothing more than wait handed their grandchildren an asset that had compounded in value for decades without a single active decision made along the way. The modern version of this same idea now trades on public stock exchanges as timberland real estate investment REITs, holding millions of acres of forest on behalf of investors who, much like those early families, mostly just let it grow. Number 9. Owning the water. Before most American cities had taken over their own water systems, private water companies controlled access to a resource that no household or business could simply choose to go without.
Owning the pipe that water had to pass through meant owning a toll booth on something everyone needed every single day, with no real substitute and no way around it. The exact business model faded as cities gradually took over municipal utilities through the 20th century, but the underlying principle, own the bottleneck infrastructure, not the product flowing through it, still drives some of the most stable, boring, and reliably profitable investments in modern real estate, toll roads, and logistics. Number 8. The ledger as a credit system. Before credit scores existed, merchants kept detailed ledgers tracking exactly who paid their bills on time, who could be trusted with a larger order on credit, and who needed to pay cash up front every single time. A merchant's good name, carefully recorded across years of ledger entries, was worth more than any collateral he could have offered instead. Entire regional supply chains ran on handshake deals backed by nothing but a reputation that had been built slowly and deliberately over many years of kept promises. Trust, recorded carefully and protected fiercely, was the original credit score, and in a town where everyone knew everyone, it often moved faster and judged more accurately than any bank ever could. Number 7. Pivoting the factory floor overnight. In 1940 and 1941, before Pearl Harbor had even been bombed, the U.S. War Department commissioned the Singer Manufacturing Company, a name known across America for sewing machines, not weapons, to produce a trial run of 500 military pistols. The Singer machinists, trained for decades on precision sewing mechanisms, retooled their factory floor and turned out all 500 military pistols, proving the equipment and the workforce could be repointed at a new product almost overnight. Singer couldn't quite hit the production speed the War Department needed, so the larger pistol contract went elsewhere to manufacturers who scaled it into the millions. But the War Department had seen enough of Singer's precision to hand them something even more valuable instead, a contract to build aviation fire control instruments for the rest of the war. Those original 500 Singer-made pistols are now so rare that they sell at auction for well into 5 figures, prized by collectors precisely because almost nobody knows they exist outside the small world of military firearms history. The fortunes made from wartime contracts often went not to the most innovative company in the room, but to the one that already had the machinery sitting there, ready to be repointed at a new customer, the government. Now here's something most history classes skip entirely. The wealthiest American families of the early 20th century weren't simply lucky to be alive during a boom. Many of them got their real start during the exact opposite, a crash nobody talks about. Number 6. The Forgotten Depression of 1920-21. Within about 12 months, consumer prices in the United States fell by roughly 16%, one of the steepest one-year drops in the country's entire history. Industrial production collapsed by nearly a third. Business failures roughly tripled. Unemployment estimates from the era ran as high as 19%, and even the more conservative modern estimates still place it well into double digits. Farmers who had borrowed heavily to expand during the high prices of the First World War watched the value of their crops collapse out from under them, while the debt taken on to buy that land and equipment stayed exactly the same size. The Federal Reserve, rather than easing rates to soften the blow, actually kept its discount rate at 7% through the worst of it. A deliberate, almost brutal contrast to the policy response decades later during the Great Depression. And yet, Almost nobody alive today has heard of this one, because the recovery was so unusually fast that it got erased from public memory by the boom that immediately followed. Unemployment had fallen to roughly 6.7% by 1922 and down near 2.4% by 1923. Businesses that survived the deflation by cutting costs ruthlessly and buying out struggling competitors at fire sale prices came out the other side with market share their rivals spent a decade trying to win back. This kind of aggressive, buy-the-competition consolidation during a downturn was standard practice in factory towns across the country, until antitrust enforcement in the 1930s and beyond made it far harder to pull off without drawing serious government scrutiny. Number 5. Securing the government contract before the war starts. The companies that profited most from wartime production weren't, as a rule, the ones that scrambled into action the moment war broke out. They were the ones that had spent years quietly building relationships with military procurement officers long before any contract was on the table, staying reliable on small orders, showing up consistently, being the easy, low-drama vendor during peacetime when there was nothing dramatic to win. That unglamorous groundwork is exactly what put a company first in line once the large contracts suddenly appeared. Relationships, far more often than raw innovation, decided who got rich off a war. Number 4. Buying counter to the crowd every time. Across nearly every fortune on this list, the same single habit repeats itself in different clothing, buying assets precisely when everyone else is desperate to sell them. Not because the buyer possessed some unusual genius for timing markets, but because the buyer had already decided long before any crisis hit that panic would eventually create opportunity, and had deliberately kept the cash and the nerve in reserve for that exact, unpredictable moment. It's the same instinct behind the 1893 buyers, the same instinct behind the Depression-era consolidators, and the same instinct modern investors still chase, usually without the discipline that actually made it work the first time. Number 3. The unglamorous business your competitors are too proud to start. Across timber, brick, water, and ice, the same quiet rule keeps showing up. Status-conscious entrepreneurs avoid boring, dirty, or socially unimpressive businesses, which leaves the entire field wide open for anyone willing to swallow the embarrassment and simply collect the margin nobody else wanted badly enough to fight for. Number 2. Treating reputation as the real currency. Before instant background checks, credit bureaus, and algorithmic trust scores, a person's word, tracked carefully across years of ledgers, kept deals, and small honored promises, was the actual infrastructure that allowed commerce to move between strangers who might never see each other again. Fortunes were quietly built simply by being the name that people trusted enough to extend credit to without asking twice. Number 1. Owning the bottleneck, not the product. This is the thread running underneath every single move on this list. The railroads, the ice warehouses, the brickyards, the water pipes, the timber left to grow untouched, the factory floor sitting ready to be repointed at a new buyer. None of it was ever really about having the most exciting product on the market. It was about owning the one choke point that everyone else eventually had no real choice but to pass through. That principle has been quietly building fortunes since before the Civil War, and it remains the one lesson modern business media rarely teaches in any depth, mostly because there's no flashy product to sell you alongside it.
Every move on this list funneled toward the exact same outcome. Stay liquid when others can't afford to be. Own what people genuinely cannot avoid needing, and let patience do the compounding instead of leaving everything to luck. None of it required a special education, a head start, or a connection to anyone powerful. It required noticing the moment everyone around you was panicking and choosing to do the one unglamorous, patient thing instead. The families who built lasting wealth in this country were not, as a rule, smarter than everyone else living through the same collapses. They simply knew what to do in the moment everyone else froze, and they were willing to look a little foolish, buying when it seemed crazy, owning the boring business nobody respected, long enough for the math to prove them right. Pick one idea from this list, even something as small as looking up your own county's next tax auction listing, and actually look into it this week. Then come back and tell me what you found.